Diana was 57, a woman who had weathered more than her share of storms. She had raised two children, worked part-time jobs while her husband built his business, and carved out a quiet dignity for herself in the spaces where no one applauded. To neighbors and friends, she was the steady one, the wife who hosted dinner parties, the mother who never missed a recital, the woman whose marriage looked like a portrait of endurance. But endurance, she knew, was not the same as happiness. On the surface, life was moving toward a moment of joy. Their daughter's wedding was weeks away, and the house buzzed with planning. Guest lists, floral arrangements, last-minute fittings, the kind of chaos that keeps a family on its toes. Diana threw herself into it, determined that her daughter's day would shine brighter than any shadow. Still, in the late hours when the house grew quiet, shadows had a way of stretching long. Her husband, James, had begun to drift. He stayed out late, claiming long meetings. His phone never left his pocket. He laughed less, smiled rarely, and when he did, it felt borrowed, like it belonged to someone else. Diana would later admit, in her own words, "At first I thought it was stress. Weddings are expensive. Business can be ruthless. I told myself it was nothing more than pressure. But when you've lived with a man for 30 years, you know when the air has changed. I could feel him slipping, and no amount of pretending would stop it." The first clear sign came with the arrival of the maid of honor. Her name was Claire, 32, magnetic, the sort of woman who drew attention without trying. She was introduced as her daughter's childhood friend, someone who had drifted in and out of their lives over the years. To Diana, she seemed friendly enough at first, quick to smile, eager to help, armed with the kind of energy that made her daughter's stress dissolve into laughter. But Diana noticed the way James's gaze lingered a fraction too long. There was a dinner one night, a casual meal, just the four of them. Claire leaned forward, laughing at a story James told. His eyes sparkled in a way Diana had not seen in years. The sound of Claire's laugh filled the dining room, and for a heartbeat too long, James looked at her as though no one else was in the room. Diana sipped her wine, silent, her smile fixed like porcelain. Later, she admitted what churned beneath that silence. She laughed too long. He looked too hard. It was small, so small anyone else might have missed it. But I didn't, because when you've spent 3 decades watching a man, you know when his eyes have wandered into dangerous places. She told herself she was imagining it. After all, what woman wants to believe her husband is slipping into another's orbit, especially a woman who still wanted to believe in vows spoken decades earlier? She chose for the moment not to act, but silence has a way of sharpening doubt. The days that followed brought more signs. James's sudden bursts of generosity, flowers that arrived without occasion, dinners where he seemed distracted but oddly eager to impress. Claire's frequent presence, always with some excuse tied to wedding planning. Whispers between them cut short when Diana entered the room. The marriage, once a fortress of routine, began to feel like a house with too many unlocked doors. Diana was no stranger to betrayal, not directly, but through stories told in hushed voices by friends and neighbors. She had always imagined herself immune, protected by the sheer weight of years, by the investment of time, family, and history. Now that illusion felt fragile. She found herself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of her husband's return. His footsteps, once familiar and comforting, now carried an edge of secrecy. Diana would later confess to herself, in words only she could own, "I told myself I wouldn't be paranoid. I told myself I was too old for jealousy, too wise for suspicion. But I wasn't. I was just a woman watching her life tilt in a direction she couldn't control." The story of infidelity was beginning to write itself, but Diana's life was about to reveal something far darker. That what tied James and Claire together was not just lust or secrecy. It was something criminal, and the wedding that was meant to celebrate love would soon become the stage for a police raid that shattered everything. If Diana's life had been a stage, then Claire's arrival was the moment the lighting shifted. Subtle, but enough to cast shadows where once there had been clarity. Claire had a way of making herself indispensable. She was at fittings, tasting menus, Even late-night planning sessions where she and James would linger over wine long after others had gone to bed. To the bride, she was a savior. To the guests, she was charming. To Diana, she was an intrusion wrapped in silk. Diana's instincts had never failed her. She had trusted them to raise her children, to navigate friendships, to survive a marriage that wasn't always simple. And now those instincts whispered that the bond between James and Claire was more than innocent. One afternoon, Diana walked into the study, carrying a folder of wedding contracts. James and Claire were huddled close over the desk, their heads nearly touching. Claire's perfume, something sweet and sharp, hung heavy in the room. They pulled apart too quickly, like teenagers caught. James forced a smile. "We're just going over some vendor details. Claire knows someone who can get us a better deal on photography," Claire added, her voice light, almost playful. "I was just helping out. You know how much I want this wedding to be perfect." Diana said nothing. She only nodded, her face unreadable. But later, when she recounted the moment in her own mind, the truth was harsher. "They thought I was blind. They thought years had dulled me. But every whisper, every sideways glance, I collected them like evidence. Not enough to accuse, not yet, but enough to know the ground beneath me was shifting." The small signs became a pattern. A phone that buzzed late into the night. Messages deleted before morning. James's sudden urge to update his wardrobe, to lose weight, to groom himself with a care he hadn't shown in years. Claire's laughter at jokes that weren't funny, her hand brushing his arm a little too easily. Still, Diana bided her time. She was not a woman to explode without proof. The turning point came at a bridal shower. Claire had organized most of it, basking in the praise of guests. James arrived late, his tie loose, his face flushed. He made a beeline to Claire before greeting anyone else. Their exchange was quiet, but Diana caught fragments. James's voice, low and urgent. "Not here. We'll talk later." Claire's eyes flickered toward Diana before she replied softly, "Don't worry, no one suspects." Diana kept her composure, smiling as if she hadn't heard, but inside she burned. Later she admitted, "That was the moment I knew. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't jealousy. It was betrayal, standing right in front of me, daring me to see it." Yet even as anger rose in her chest, another realization took hold. There was something else beneath their secrecy, something weightier than stolen glances or whispered promises. James had always been careful with money, almost obsessively so. Yet in recent weeks, Diana noticed unusual withdrawals, large sums disappearing, sometimes replaced with excuses that didn't add up. Once she found a receipt tucked into his jacket pocket, a payment to a company she had never heard of. When she asked, James waved it off. "Just a business expense, nothing to worry about." But worry was all Diana felt. Claire's presence, James's evasions, the strange financial trail, it all wove into a web that didn't look like a simple affair. It looked like something orchestrated, something dangerous. Diana began to watch more closely. She noted times, dates, excuses. She started keeping her own quiet log, each entry a thread in a tapestry of deceit. One night, as James slept heavily beside her, his phone buzzed. Diana reached for it, her hands trembling. The message flashed briefly before vanishing, but she caught enough to etch it into memory. "Invoices are ready. We'll deliver at the wedding. Make sure she doesn't find out." Diana froze. The words seared into her mind. Invoices. Delivery. A warning to keep her in the dark. This wasn't just romance gone astray. This was business. Dirty business. She set the phone back down, her heart pounding. James stirred but did not wake. In the dim light of their bedroom, Diana lay awake until dawn. The truth dawning, sharper than the sunrise. She would later put it into words no one could mistake. It wasn't just about another woman. It was about money, fraud, lies tied so tight together they could choke the air out of a room. I realized then that my marriage wasn't just breaking, it was criminal. The shadows had stretched fully now, long and dark across her once stable life. The wedding meant to bind her family closer was becoming the stage for a betrayal that reached far beyond love. And Diana, silent and watchful, was beginning to plan. Diana had spent years perfecting the art of patience. Raising children taught her when to speak, and when silence was sharper than words. Marriage taught her when to bend and when to stand firm. But betrayal required a different kind of patience, one that carried teeth. She began quietly the way a detective might. She combed through household files, the drawers where James stacked receipts and invoices with little thought. The numbers didn't lie. Payments made to companies she'd never heard of, vendors that didn't appear in any wedding contracts. Some were small, meant to slip under notice. Others were staggering, sums that could not be explained by a florist's bill or a band's deposit. Diana knew her husband's habits. He was meticulous about business, but careless at home. That carelessness became her weapon. One night she waited until James left his laptop open on the desk. Her hands shook as she slid into the chair. Emails, spreadsheets, documents with names that meant nothing to her. Clearwater Holdings, Golden Finch Services, companies that, as far as she could tell, didn't exist. Then she found the messages. Some were brief, coded, others bolder. One stood out, dated just a week prior. Invoices prepared, transfer at reception, ensure the maid of honor oversees collection. Diana read the line again, the words burrowing into her chest. The maid of honor, Claire. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Claire wasn't simply her husband's mistress, she was his accomplice. Diana pressed the laptop closed, her breath ragged. She would not confront him, not yet. Rage was tempting, but rage would expose her. Instead, she began her own secret archive. She copied receipts, photographed documents, slipped notes into a folder she hid deep in her closet. Later, she would describe her resolve with quiet steel. I knew what I was walking into. If I accused him too soon, he'd lie. If I told my daughter, I'd ruin her wedding. So I kept quiet. I gathered. I waited. If he thought I was blind, I'd let him think it, until I had enough to make him choke on his lies. The deeper she looked, the darker it grew. She overheard hushed phone calls. James's voice clipped and urgent. She noticed Claire slipping into their home under flimsy excuses, discussing flowers, rehearsal dinners, always leaving with documents or envelopes tucked under her arm. Diana's silence became her shield. She smiled at dinners, nodded at jokes, and played the part of the unsuspecting wife. But beneath the surface, every gesture was calculated. She was building a case, one brick at a time. Then came the night she found the text. James had left his phone charging on the nightstand. The screen lit up at 1:14 a.m. Diana's eyes flicked open, catching the glow. A message scrolled across the lock screen before disappearing. Final list done. Bring documents to the venue. We'll settle with the others after. The words confirmed everything. Documents, settling, transactions disguised as wedding business. The affair had been her first wound, but this was something larger. Fraud, blackmail, a network of deceit using the wedding as cover. Diana lay still, her heart racing, as James shifted in his sleep beside her. She stared at the ceiling, realizing that her husband's betrayal wasn't just private, it was criminal. The next morning, she made a choice. She reached out to an old friend, Daniel, a retired detective who had once investigated white-collar crimes. They met in a quiet cafe, Diana clutching the folder of evidence she had compiled. Daniel flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. Finally, he looked up. Diana, this isn't just infidelity. This is serious fraud. Shell companies, falsified invoices, money laundering. If what you've gathered is accurate, your husband and that woman are neck deep in a criminal operation. Diana's voice trembled, but her eyes held steady. I don't want revenge. I want the truth exposed, and I want it done where he least expects it. Daniel leaned back, measuring her words. Then he nodded slowly. The wedding? Everyone will be there. If they're planning to move documents or money at the reception, we can set up a sting. But Diana, once this starts, there's no undoing it. She met his gaze, her voice cold. I've lived half my life with a man I didn't really know. Undoing is all that's left. From that moment, the plan began to take shape. Diana continued to play her role, the dutiful wife, the gracious hostess. She smiled through rehearsals, posed for photos, even thanked Claire for her endless help. But behind her composure was a woman transformed. Every step brought her closer to the night when truth would no longer hide. The lies were piling high, but Diana was done being buried beneath them. She was ready to set them on fire. They said weddings are full of magic. Diana thought that afternoon that they were full of better camouflage. The venue, a restored manor with high windows and a lawn that smelled faintly of cut grass and perfume, gleamed under an obliging sky. Guests arrived in waves, cousins in pastel, college friends in sequins, a scattering of business acquaintances James had invited for networking. The air hummed with congratulations and the clink of crystal. Laughter folded over itself like music. But beneath the music, Diana felt a different rhythm. Feet tapping to a countdown only she and a handful of others could hear. She had rehearsed her part until it fit like a glove. Polite smiles, a measured thank you for every compliment. Warmth where strangers might expect cold. Nobody would have guessed she'd spent weeks threading a net through the people around her. Daniel had been careful. Quiet calls, discreet meetings with a plainclothes unit from the city's financial crime squad. They had vetted the paperwork she'd gathered. They'd traced payments, matched account numbers, mapped transfers to shell entities that linked back to James's business accounts. On the morning of the wedding, Daniel cornered her by the flower cart, his face set like stone. "This is it," he said bluntly. "Once we move, there's no stepping back. Officers are in place. We've got a warrant. We'll wait for the handoff. When Claire takes those envelopes, we move." Diana nodded. Her hands were steady. "Make sure everyone who needs to be there is in plain view," she replied. "And no mistakes. This night isn't for spectacle. It's for justice." He squeezed her shoulder once, then folded into the background like a shadow who'd rehearsed his exit. The reception had been staged to encourage the kind of movement James and Claire favored. A long head table, strategically placed near the entrance for better photo ops. A secondary table where vendors and payments were to be checked, ostensibly for last-minute tips, transport, and gratuities. It was the perfect spot for a discreet exchange, and Diana had planted the bait. Guests danced, speeches were made. The bride, Diana's daughter, gave a toast that made half the room cry and the other half reach for tissues they didn't need. Plates were cleared. The band launched into an upbeat song that made shoulders sway. James, for all his charm tonight, wore the tiredness of someone who'd been carrying a secret too long. He moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. Claire flitted beside him, an attentive shadow carrying a small leather folder Diana had seen earlier in James's jacket pocket. The folder, Daniel had told her, would hold the invoices and the list. Everything that tied the shell companies to payments the two of them had arranged. Diana observed, quiet and composed. She watched Claire tuck the folder under her arm, watched the way James's fingers brushed hers when he handed her a glass. The two of them slipped toward the vendor table, as if guided by habit. Claire's face was the practiced mask of a woman used to performing. Diana's pulse kept time with the music. She imagined the officers spread through the hall, two at the back by the exit, another near the coat room, a plainclothes pair seated as guests. Daniel was by the bandstand, an ordinary guest with an extraordinary burden. Someone from the squad had suggested a single, unassuming move. Let the exchange happen in public. Make it look like a routine transfer of a check or a vendor payment. That would keep the suspects from bolting, and it would keep the guests from panicking until the right moment. James and Claire reached the vendor table. Claire opened the leather folder and began pulling envelopes. Thin, white, stamped with the venue's return address. She slid one across to an older man who'd been listed as a vendor liaison, then tucked another behind a stack of menus. The choreography was precise. Each movement had the casual ease of someone who believed themselves untouchable. Diana held her breath. The band's saxophone wailed. A child tripped on a ribbon. At the exact time Daniel had promised, a man in a dark suit, plain clothes, badge hidden, approached the table and asked an innocuous question about the cake. Claire looked up, blinked, and in that fraction of a second, someone from the squad across the room moved. "Police! Everyone stay where you are!" A voice cut through the music like a knife. Glass rattled. Conversation hitched mid-breath. A hush that felt like the moment before a storm fell. Chaos unfurled, stiff and fast. Guests glanced around, uncertain whether they'd missed an inside joke. James's jovial mask cracked. Claire's smile faltered. She turned, hand halfway to an envelope, and found herself facing two officers whose badges had suddenly become the loudest thing in the room. Diana watched as the carefully constructed life they'd both been living split in front of her. Two officers moved toward James, another toward Claire. Hands were taken behind backs. Someone shouted her daughter's name. Then another voice called for calm. Cameras flashed. A phone began recording. The reception's music trailed into silence like the end of a film. James's face went from pink to pale in the space of a heartbeat. His voice, when he found it, was thin. This is a mistake. I don't... Claire's protests were sharper, a higher pitch that cracked easily. You've got the wrong people. This is our wedding. This is... Daniel stepped forward, document folder in hand, and laid out the evidence in a way that needed no flourish. Bank transfers, forged invoices, email chains linking shell companies to the payments exchanged that night. Officers retrieved the envelopes, matched serial numbers to accounts. The room smelled suddenly like perfume and fear. Diana felt a strange detachment, the way you feel observing an accident from across the street. The wedding she'd worked so hard to polish had become a courtroom without walls. The guests watched as the lines between love and betrayal, between party and plunder, were drawn in bold, irreversible strokes. She did not gloat. There was no joy in it, only a hard, clear relief that something true had finally been named. When the handcuffs clicked, when the murmurs swelled into outright sobs and angry shouts, Diana thought of the small folder she'd kept in her closet, the quiet archive that had become a weapon. She had not wanted a spectacle. She had wanted the truth. Around her, her daughter's wedding unraveled into an image Diana would carry with her for the rest of her life. Lace, confetti, and the sound of men in suits escorting two people away from the head table. Justice, in the end, had arrived in a tuxedo. The air in the ballroom was thick with perfume and champagne. For most, the reception was the height of celebration, a swirl of dancing, music, laughter, and clinking glasses. But for Diana, every detail felt sharpened, as though the world had slipped into slow motion. She sat at her table, hands folded in her lap, watching her husband lean close to Claire, their heads bent together, voices pitched low. The small leather folder, that folder, rested under Claire's hand, half hidden by the centerpiece of roses and candles. Guests around them were oblivious. Toasts were raised. The photographer darted between tables. The bride twirled in her gown like a figure from a fairy tale. Diana's daughter had no idea her wedding was doubling as a sting operation. Then the signal came. Two plainclothes officers moved forward, their steps smooth but deliberate. One placed a hand gently on Claire's shoulder. The other addressed James with a voice that cut through the chatter. James Collins, Claire Bennett, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Please stand. The words struck the room like a bell. Conversations faltered, glasses froze midair. A ripple of disbelief swept across the guests, whispers colliding in a rising tide. James blinked, stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for water. This is absurd. I don't know what you're talking about. Claire's voice was sharper, her composure cracking under the weight of attention. You can't do this here. This is a wedding, for God's sake. You have no right. The officer raised a badge, his tone firm. We have every right. We have a warrant. Stand up. The band faltered to silence, instruments trailing off mid-song. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests rose, some backing away, others craning to see. The bride's face turned pale, her bouquet trembling in her grip. Diana did not move. She watched, calm, detached. The moment she had waited for was unfolding exactly as planned. James pushed back his chair, his face mottled with fury and fear. Diana, say something. Tell them this is a mistake. You know me. You know I wouldn't. Her voice was quiet, steady. I know exactly what you've done. It was the first time she had spoken aloud, the first crack in the silence she'd carried for weeks. The words sliced through the chaos, final and unyielding. Gasps rippled. Guests turned, realization dawning that this wasn't some random intrusion. This was personal. The officers pulled Claire to her feet, her protests, dissolved into sobs as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. James struggled, jerking against the grip of the men beside him. His face flushed red, spit flying as he shouted, "You set me up! You did this! After everything I've given you, everything I built! How dare you?" Diana's gaze held his, cold and unwavering. She said nothing more. Daniel stepped forward then, the folder of evidence in his hand. He laid it on the table for all to see. Receipts, invoices, bank transfers. Proof undeniable. Proof that Diana had delivered. The guests whispered fiercely, the story spreading from table to table faster than any toast ever could. What had been a wedding reception was now a courtroom, the dance floor a crime scene. The bride collapsed into her mother's arms, tears streaking her makeup. "Mom, what's happening? How long? How long have you known?" Diana held her close, whispering into her hair. "Long enough to make sure today ended with the truth." The officers guided James and Claire toward the exit, their protests swallowed by the rising hum of disbelief and shock. Cameras flashed, phones held high as guests captured the spectacle. Some cried, others muttered about disgrace, betrayal, the sheer audacity of such a scheme. Diana remained seated, her daughter's hand clutched tightly in hers. She felt strangely weightless, as though a burden she had carried for years had been stripped from her shoulders. The life she thought she knew was over, but at least it had ended in truth, not silence. When the doors closed behind James and Claire, the room exhaled. The music did not return. The wedding was no longer a wedding, it was an ending. And Diana, calm amidst the storm, understood that what had collapsed tonight was not just her marriage, but the illusion of it. Later, when asked how she felt in that moment, she would say, "I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt clean, like I'd opened every window in a house that had been sealed too long. The lies were gone. The air was sharp. I could finally breathe." The manor stood hushed after the storm. The officers had gone, James and Claire with them, leaving a vacuum that pressed against the walls. Guests lingered in tight circles, whispering, their voices low but urgent, as though volume itself might summon back the chaos. The wedding tables sat abandoned, glasses half full, candles guttering in pools of wax. Diana sat quietly at the head table, her daughter folded against her shoulder. The young bride's dress shimmered faintly in the dim light, stained now with tears instead of champagne. "Why didn't you tell me?" her daughter whispered, voice raw. "Why did it have to happen like this? Tonight of all nights." Diana brushed a strand of hair from her child's damp cheek. "Because if I told you sooner, it would have destroyed you. And if I waited any longer, it would have destroyed me." Her daughter's sobs shook them both, but Diana's arms stayed steady. She had spent decades holding her family together. Tonight she was holding what was left. Across the room, relatives avoided her gaze. Some looked with pity, others with confusion. A few, she noticed, with suspicion, as if wondering how long she had known, how much she had allowed. Diana bore their stares without flinching. Later she would put it plainly. People always want someone to blame. Him, her, me. It doesn't matter. They need a villain to make sense of what they don't understand. But the truth doesn't care about comfort. It just stands there, daring you to look at it. When the last of the guests had trickled away, Diana found herself alone in the reception hall. The band had packed up. The staff moved quietly through the wreckage of overturned glasses and crushed petals. The silence was louder than the music had been. She walked to the table where the leather folder had been laid bare. The papers were gone, bagged as evidence, but the indentation of them remained on the tablecloth. She touched the empty space with her fingertips. "All those years I thought our marriage was built on trust," she murmured to herself. "Turns out it was built on silence. I just didn't know whose silence it was, mine or his." The house was no kinder when she returned that night. James's shoes still rested by the door, his jacket slung over the chair. Familiar objects transformed into artifacts of betrayal. Diana stood in the hallway, staring at them, before finally gathering his things into a box. She left it by the door, not for him, but for herself, a symbol that his place here had ended. Her daughter joined her in the kitchen, red-eyed, her veil discarded on the counter. "I don't know how to face tomorrow," she whispered. "How do we explain this to everyone? Diana poured them both tea, her hands surprisingly steady. "We don't explain," she said softly. "We survive. Let the truth explain itself." The night stretched long. Diana did not sleep. Instead, she sat at the dining table with the folder she had once hidden in her closet, her secret arsenal. Now that it had served its purpose, it felt lighter, as though the paper itself had lost its weight. She slid it into an envelope, sealed it, and placed it in the drawer. Her mind replayed James's face as the cuffs closed around his wrists, his outrage, his fear, the way he had called her name, expecting her to rescue him, to stand by him even in his deceit. For 30 years I carried his secrets, she thought, but this time I carried my own. Dawn crept in slowly, painting the kitchen in pale light. Diana rose, her body stiff but her resolve firm. She looked in the mirror by the hallway and studied the lines of her face. They were deeper now, etched by years of compromise, but her eyes had never been clearer. When asked later how she endured those first days after the wedding, she said simply, "I didn't endure," I decided. There's a difference. Endurance is waiting for something to end. Decision is ending it yourself. By the end of the week, James's business was all over the news. Fraud, conspiracy, laundering. The headlines devoured his reputation with a hunger that mirrored his own greed. Claire's name appeared alongside his, stripped of glamour, reduced to ink on paper. Diana clipped one article, folded it neatly, and slid it into the envelope with the rest of the evidence. She told herself it was not for revenge, it was for memory. For decades, she had lived as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's silent keeper. Now, in the ruins of her marriage, she began to see herself as something else, someone no longer bound by silence, someone who had chosen truth, even when it shattered everything. The wedding had ended in sirens, but Diana's life continued in silence. The days after the raid blurred together, a carousel of lawyers, detectives, and headlines. Family called in hushed voices, neighbors left casseroles at the door as though food could patch over betrayal. Everyone wanted to know how she felt. Everyone wanted her reaction, her tears, her rage. But Diana gave them none. She moved through her house like a woman cataloging a museum. Every object carried a memory she could no longer trust. The photographs on the wall, the clock they'd bought on an anniversary trip, the wine glasses chipped from too many celebrations. All of it belonged to a life that had ended the night James was led away in handcuffs. And yet she didn't feel broken. She would later explain it in words only she could craft. People think betrayal destroys you. It doesn't. It chisels you. It strips away the softness, the illusions, until you're left with something sharper, harder, something that can cut through lies without hesitation. Diana learned quickly that the world divided itself after the scandal. Some offered pity, some whispered judgment, some looked at her as if she carried the stain of James's crimes herself. But she no longer cared for their opinions. She had walked through fire, and fire no longer feared her. The divorce papers arrived. She signed them with steady hands. His name, once something she had written lovingly on letters and holiday cards, now looked foreign on the page, a name no longer tied to her own. One afternoon, she visited the courthouse for a follow-up with the detective team. The corridor smelled of coffee and paper, the walls lined with other people's ruin. Daniel greeted her with a nod, respect in his tired eyes. "You know," he told her, "most people in your position would have looked the other way, pretended not to know. It's easier, cleaner. You chose the harder path." Diana met his gaze unflinching. "I didn't choose it," she said. "It chose me the moment I opened his laptop." After that, silence wasn't an option. Not anymore. On her way out, she passed a woman crying, quietly outside a courtroom. Diana paused, considering offering comfort, but instead kept walking. She wasn't unkind. She was simply changed. Her compassion now belonged to herself. At home, she began making small decisions that felt monumental. She sold James's car. She cleared his clothes from the closet, leaving hangers that rattled when she opened the door. She replaced the photographs in the hallway with her own, landscapes she had taken on long-forgotten trips, moments where the world had belonged to her alone. The house felt lighter, though emptier. She welcomed the emptiness. It was honest. Her daughter visited often, still struggling with the ruin of her wedding day. One evening, they sat together on the porch, the air heavy with the smell of summer rain. "Do you ever regret it?" her daughter asked softly. "Exposing it all like that? Turning the wedding into what it became?" Diana thought for a long time before answering. "Regret?" she echoed. "No, because regret belongs to people who still wish they could change the past. I don't. I wanted the truth, and I got it." She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "He thought he buried me in lies," she said. "But in the end, I buried him in truth." The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. For the first time in years, Diana felt free. Not triumphant, not victorious, but free. Her life was no longer measured by silence or shadow. It was measured by the weight of honesty, heavy but bearable. As the evening darkened around them, Diana looked out across the yard, her daughter's hand still in hers, and realized she was no longer the woman who had once ignored red flags and swallowed suspicion. She was someone new, someone forged, and though the years ahead would not be easy, they would at least be hers, entirely hers.